Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is African World Studies, and we're fortunate to have with us to talk about Africa and the part that is played by many people dealing with the study of African studies, Dr. Leonard Jeffries. Dr. Leonard Jeffries, of course, is from New York, and with Dr. Jeffries is Dr. AThompson. And of course, Dr. Jeffries and Dr. Thompson, let me welcome both of you to the show this morning.
Well, Dr. Haney, we certainly are, it's a pleasure to join your audience, especially to deal with the important topic of African world studies.
As a matter of fact, I think Dr. Jeffries, you and Dr. Thompson are both members of the board of directors of a very, very important organization dealing with the study of Africa from a worldwide perspective. We're going to talk about that organization this morning and talk about some of the things that the two of you have been involved in. But before we do that, Dr. Jeffries, let's have you and later Dr. Thompson to give us some information about your background, your education, and some of the things that were important in terms of leading you eventually to where you are this morning. And of course, if you'll take a few minutes in developing that, Dr. Thompson will give us the same kind of information, and then we'll be able to talk about the topic this morning, Africa World Studies.
Well, certainly, Dr. Haney, I have had a chance to travel around the world, but my beginnings are very, like everyone else, in the urban community of Newark, New Jersey. I was born. My folks are from, my mother's side is Virginia, Farmville, Virginia. My father's side is Kelly, Georgia, south of Atlanta, in the Monticello area. And I've been blessed to come from this very humble home, but to be given a sense of purpose and direction in my life. And so my studies were serious, and my mother and others directed me toward looking at the larger world. So I had a chance to travel. After I went to Lafayette College, I won a Rotary International Fellowship. That allowed me to travel to Europe, study in Switzerland, study in France. That opened up another world to me, a worldview. And shortly after that, I was able to come back and met a black minister who was from Tennessee, Knoxville, Tennessee, the Reverend James H. Robinson, and he had a program called Operation Crossroads Africa. And that gave me a chance to travel to Africa in 1961. And ever since then, I've been able to travel around the world, been over 100 trips to Africa, South America, the Caribbean. And so African world studies is very real to me. I've been able to live it, I've been able to experience it. My PhD was on Africa, the economic development of the Ivory Coast Republic, which is in the news now in Africa. My master's actually was on Africa, too, in African world studies. It was on the 4-year development plan of the Republic of Senegal in West Africa. So we have had a chance to not only finish the traditional studies in America, but to expand it into the world community and to see Africa worldwide, Africa in Brazil, Africa in the Caribbean, Africa at home here in America, Africa on the continent itself. And we've been able to organize instruments of taking the African world studies and making them work for us. For example, we formed in 1969 the African Heritage Studies Association. That allowed us to look at Africa. And then we also formed a later organization such as the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilization, which is the reason why we're here in Nashville for this coming together of the African world family.
Very good. And of course, Dr. Thompson, what about your background and some of your experiences?
I'm a product of Chicago by way of Columbus, Mississippi on my mother's side, and Holly Springs, Mississippi on my father's side. And I started in public school systems of the city of Chicago as a classroom teacher, finally an administrator in a high school. And from that time on up, let us say 1966, I started working at Northeastern Illinois University, Center for Inner City Studies. And we sort of stumbled into studying about Africa. It was during the time there was great African consciousness. Many of the countries overseas were fighting for their independence, and we participated in that program. As a result, we started a kind of an African Caribbean studies program at Northeastern in the city of Chicago. We started traveling to Africa in 1974 to the 6th Pan-African Conference, which took place during that time. And from that point on, we started going to Africa practically every year. Out of this developed many associations and organizations. It altered the kind of curriculum we were teaching at the university. And then finally, out of nowhere, came this very important event that took place in Los Angeles in 1984, which was the beginning of the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilization. Since that time, we've all been going back and forth to Egypt, which we don't use the term Egypt, we give it its proper name, Kemet, which is another name, and perhaps we'll discuss that a bit more.
Very good.
In addition to going to Africa, we've also been going to Brazil, other places as well, wherever we find African people.
Very good, and I tell you, we're getting ready for our first commercial break, Drs. Jeffries and Thompson. And when we come back, we'll have an opportunity to talk about the organization that you represent today and how that fits into Africa. There's so much that the two of you, I'm sure, can tell us about Africa, and so we want you to just take that opportunity to inform our audience this morning about Africa. And of course, we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you, and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. The topic is African World Studies, and we're talking to Drs. Jeffries and Thompson. Dr. Jeffries, before we had our first commercial break, both you and Dr. Thompson gave us excellent information dealing with your background and experience and the organization that the two of you represent. What we'd like to do today is to take advantage of the knowledge that the two of you have and to give you an opportunity to speak to us in reference to some of the critical issues that you believe to be important dealing with the organization that the two of you represented. So let's start with you, Dr. Jeffries, and of course, Dr. Thompson, you will assist us in developing that idea.
Well, I think initially it's important for us to clarify some definitions of what we mean. When we say African World Studies, it's not something that's outside of us, it's a part of us. We, as people of African descent, realize that whatever we do in America is a part of African World Studies. And so we need to relate it. And we use the term Pan-Africanism, meaning the connectedness between peoples of African background. So we don't want to define African World Studies as some strange thing outside of us. It's a part of us. What we do as Africans in America and African Americans is a part of African World Studies. Our great leaders understood that, and they linked up with the African peoples wherever they found them. So we have, as individual scholars, our own background, but we've bonded together in intellectual and spiritual organizations, and the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilization is one. The idea was birthed in 1984, and it was institutionalized in Los Angeles. It was institutionalized in 1985 in Chicago with Dr. Thompson and Dr. Carruthers and others at the Center for Inner City Studies and the Kemetic Institute. And then they had the next major conference in 1986 in New York. And we helped organize that at the City University of New York, where I've been a professor for the last 30 or so years in African World Studies. And as a result of that, we came up with the idea to go on a pilgrimage to study in situ, to study in Africa itself. So we went to the Nile Valley, to Kemet. Almost 1,000 of us, men, women, and children, 3 generations went with me. My mother went, my nephews went, my godchildren went, my wife and I. Dr. Rouse and Jeffries was there as leaders of the organization. So that's what I'm saying, that the African World Studies, after the 1,000 came back, they went back to their teachings, to their preaching, to being engineers, to be bankers, and they brought this knowledge of who we are as African peoples back home to our communities. We need to understand that Africa is at the center of the world experience. It's in Africa that the human family was born. It's in Africa that the first civilizations and cultures rose. And so we need to understand how important this knowledge is. It was at one time believed that Africa was not a main part of human civilization, that Africans contributed nothing to civilization. We come to find out that the historical facts, the scientific facts are that Africa is the birthplace of the human family, and it's out of Africa that the first main flow of culture and civilization took place. The first writing systems, the first mathematics, the first cultural development, the first moral systems come out of African peoples. African World Studies helps us to systematize that process and put it in the classrooms and put it in our homes and put it in our institutions.
Very good. You know, Dr. Thompson, within that context, if you had to identify what your organization considered to be one of the major issues that you have to promote now at this particular time, outside of the fact that you have to tell more people about Africa?
Yes.
What would be the major issue that would center around this organization?
Well, for us,
dealing with
the
Africa?
major issue for us is to study what happened actually in the past. We call it historical memory. And if we go back as far as possible to the beginnings, most of the so-called ideas of civilization would start somewhere around rivers. The Nile River, the Indus, the Niger, the Limpopo, the Congo River. And so we've spent a considerable amount of time learning about Africa. And in so doing, we have found that as Europe seems to want to give us Greece as the center of the world and the giver of civilization, it seems to be just the opposite. Although for the European world, they see Greece as the center of everything. But now we find the Nile Valley to be the center. So we concentrate on learning the language, the ancient languages of the Nile, which some people call the hieroglyphs, we call it Medu Neche. In addition to studying those languages, we study the ancient histories before the coming of all other groups that tend to call themselves the founders of civilization. In addition to that, we've formed a structure as a result of what Dr. Jeffries just said. We now have a national organization that meets every year, every 4th or 5th year. We go overseas to have our conference. In addition to that, we have 5 regions. We have a Western region, a Midwestern region, a Southern region, an Eastern region, a Mid-Atlantic region. We have 4 commissions, one commission that deals with education, another one that deals with research, one that deals with the creative productions, and what's the other one? I left out. So whatever, we have 4. And in addition to all of those things, we are research-driven. We want to bring the history of African people down to our people, wherever we find our people. And as a result of that, then we'll understand who we are and why we are here and what our destinies will call for.
Now, what has been, Dr. Jeffries, I'm not sure about how much time we have here before the end of this segment, but what would you suggest to the individuals today to become more involved in what the two of you are doing? Because it's certainly a great scholarly activity and et cetera, but how do you get people involved in what the two of you are doing today?
Well, in order for people to have their full consciousness and a true development, they've got to study. And so I tell everybody I meet to study, to study, to study. And as a professor myself, I'm continuing to study. My wife and I both are seriously looking at and re-evaluating this whole flow of knowledge. We have to really thank those at Tennessee State University who allowed us to join them and to host this enormous activity. We have to control the development of our mind, and we cannot have this negative projection of our development imposed upon our people. If you do not have self-respect and self-understanding, you can't have true development. Whoever controls the images, remember this, whoever controls the images controls the self-esteem, the self-respect, and the self-development. Whoever controls the history controls the vision. And so for people who did not appreciate African peoples and peoples of African descent everywhere and said we participated in no historical development of significance, now we know the truth, and that truth has been revealed by the truth, that we are the foundations of the human family. We don't take a back seat to any other group, and that becomes important. That allows us to develop a sense of vision and purpose and direction so that we can move our people in the correct direction.
And of course, Dr. Jeffries and Dr. Thompson, we're getting ready for our second commercial break. But when we come back, let's see if we can have the two of you perhaps suggest how we might be able to incorporate some of the information that we're talking about now into the public school systems. Because I know, and as the two of you undoubtedly know, that even in higher education, you don't find that much information relative to what you're talking about. But how do you get it down to a lower level? And we'll talk about that when we return. We'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you and welcome back to this final segment of the show for today. We're talking to Drs. Jeffries and Thompson. And Dr. Jeffries, before we end the show for today, let's give the two of you an opportunity to, you and Dr. Thompson, the opportunity to take the information that we've talked about the African civilization and the impact that it has had and the influence that it has had. How do you get this information down to a lower level? Because it's fine and that the two of you as researchers, college professors, dealing with college students know this information. That's fine, but what about at a lower level, perhaps at the high school level or at even below that, how can this information be disseminated to a wider audience?
I think that's one of the great challenges that we face. How to get this enormous explosion of information about African peoples that reverses this whole negative information flow that was institutionalized for so many years. How do we get this information down into our families and into our institutions and organizations where it will have an impact? And that's one of the themes of our conference this weekend, to be able to put it in the hands of the youngest of our peoples who are being educated. Why? Because knowledge is power, and that means knowledge of African peoples is empowerment for African peoples. So if our youngsters are constantly bombarded with the negative images, the Tarzan images, the Sambo images, then that negative projection falls on them. But if they know that African peoples were the founders of the human family, that they raised the pyramids and temples of the Nile to their consciousness of the spirituality and their God consciousness, that they invented mathematics and writing and philosophy. When this knowledge is put in the hands of our young people, it will give them greater strength and self-motivation. I was at an affair in the Black History Month where they had a school in which the preschool through grade 8 put on a program on history. They presented the black inventors that invented so many of the things that are part of modern society, the light bulbs, the Elijah McCoy and his work. And the other classes presented, for example, the Massachusetts 54, the fight of black people in the Civil War for their own freedom, etc. So that I saw that this can be done if properly taught, properly trained instructors are available. It can be taught to our people at every grade level. I saw the preschool, I saw the first, second, third grade, the 8th grade actually implement a curriculum of this enormous truth of African world studies.
Dr. Thompson, coming from Chicago and certainly with a large African American community there, what are you doing in that great city to sort of disseminate this information throughout?
Well, on 2 occasions we actually worked with Chicago Public Schools in creating a curriculum guide for the schools. And that was done through the public school system. In addition to that, with the group I'm working with in Chicago at the Center for Inner City Studies, the Comedic Institute, we actually wrote a curriculum guide for the public. So actually we're working with community organizations as well, with the churches, but I think most importantly, you will have to get to the administrators. You must deal with the faculty and the administrators of these school systems, or of the church school systems and what have you, and teach about Africa. So we have a program called Teaching About Africa, which we have had since 1986. And across the country, in many cities, we have these programs. But the thing about being a member of the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilization, we have these regions. So therefore, wherever you go, the West, the East, the Midwest, or the South, we have communication with each other, and we're working with schools and actually bringing forth all of this information about Africa. The other thing is we cannot leave out the large, growing African communities coming from Nigeria, Ghana, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and all those places, South Africa, Zimbabwe, in Chicago, in Illinois, in Michigan, in New York, and what have you.
Here in
so now linking up with these organizations, these groups, I would consider to be most important.
Very good. And of course, I think that in order to do this, Dr. Jeffries, this requires quite a bit of resources from organizations like the organization that you have. And what are you doing, and how do you reach out in order to get people to support what you're doing financially?
Well, fortunately, we are self-funding, and the contributions made to our organization, scholars come from around the country to participate in our various conferences, and we move the conferences around the country. They pay their own expenses, and the purchase of books and other materials, tapes, helps to create the funds of money necessary for us to do the things that we have to do. And so I think it's important for us to understand that it doesn't take a great deal of money. It takes an interest, it takes an effort. The first teacher who opened up the world to me was my mother, and she taught it simply by making sure that the books were properly in place for me to understand myself, and she laid down the foundation for us to grow and develop. So our people have to start to be critical on how they spend their monies. We earn great deals of money, and we have them, but it all doesn't have to go for cars and for big homes. You've got to have a library in that home, and you've got to have your youngsters knowing that they're heading for higher education and for a greater fulfillment of their lives.
You know, Dr. Thompson, I think one of the organizations that has played a very, very significant role in terms of trying to spread the African civilization has been the Black Studies departments all over the nation. Over the last 3 or 4 minutes, 3 minutes that we have here, you and Dr. Jeffries, why don't you give us some statements in reference to these organizations, these so-called Black Studies departments and whatever, on not only historically Black institution campuses, but campuses all over the nation.
Let me just say one thing. We have a website. It's ASCAC, A-S-C-A-C.
ASCAC.
ASCAC.org. No, go ahead.
Yes, and in that website they can connect with a lot of the activities going on around the world in terms of these organizations. But it's important that you mentioned the Black Studies. I was one of the founders of the Black Studies movement in New York and also on the West Coast. I set up the Black Studies department at San Jose State University. And right now, as we speak, the National Council for Black Studies, which was formed in the 70s, just as we formed the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations in the 80s when this explosion about the Nile Valley took place, the National Council of Black Studies is meeting in Atlanta as we speak. And hundreds of scholars like ourselves and teachers and many, many hundreds of students are meeting doing some of the same things. I wish I was 2 people now, or I wish I had a helicopter. I could be here in Nashville and participate, and I could fly off to Atlanta and participate. My nephew, Dr. Hassan Jeffries, who's now at the University of Alabama, Tuscaloosa, he's presenting in Atlanta, and he will be awarded his PhD in May from Duke University. He was raised with this consciousness of world studies, so he can move in the African world, but he did his PhD on Lowndes County Freedom Party in Alabama. And he knows the importance of making the connections of African people.
Dr. Thompson, over the last 2 minutes that we have, let's give you and Dr. Jeffries, you first, Dr. Thompson, an opportunity to make some final comments to our audience this morning. We've got about 2 minutes. That gives you about a minute, and then, of course, Dr. Jeffries will have some of the things that you want to leave with us.
My most important statement is I'm happy to have been here in the state of Tennessee, a very important place for the development of the pyramid idea, which I saw in Memphis, and a continuation of the idea that we are an African people, and I think that's most important.
Dr. Jeffries.
And I would like to say, as Frederick Douglass said, in struggling against enslavement, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. And we have to continue to struggle so that progress can be realized. And I would like to say that I want to thank you in Tennessee for inviting us, and because I was affiliated with a son of Tennessee, Alex Haley. I worked with Alex for 7 years and helped him develop the Whole Roots program. And Alex showed that with perseverance and understanding, these enormous truths about us as world peoples can be revealed. And the Whole Roots phenomena is an example of African world studies. And it begins here in Tennessee, where Alex's family gave him the foundation and the interest to allow him to connect with Africa.
Over the last half minute, where did you meet Mr. Haley, and say something about that?
As I set up the Black Studies Department at San Jose State in California, in San Jose, he was in San Francisco working on the idea for Roots and trying to develop it. And he met some people who, because he had this great interest in reaching into Africa, who knew me and then my experience of going back and forth to Africa many times and studying. So we connected in 1971. 1972, we got a $500,000 grant from the Carnegie Corporation to look at the Black family worldwide. And we put on board teams of scholars that participated in this enormous work. So a great credit goes to Alex Haley, a son of Tennessee, for his contribution to African world studies.
As well as you, Dr. Jeffries, and of course, Dr. Thompson. Let me thank the 2 of you for coming by and giving us that information, and let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning.